when, in a way, to protect the precinct, to protect the staff, to protect the elected and named representatives of Parliament, how has your role, or how has this role evolved over the last 15 years? And in particular, I'm trying to think of, there was a lot of speculation in the media in terms of Russian interference in the Brexit debate. What type of lessons have you been able to learn and that you've been able to share as a baseline with members of the House of Commons and the Lords?
I think it is difficult to speak about this with much specificity in the open. Remember that there are multiple types of foreign interference, such as cybersecurity, such as interference on social false flag operations on social media, straightforward intimidation, and, if you like, economic manipulation. On economic manipulation, trying to persuade members or lords to do things in Parliament for financial gain, that isn't a matter so much about foreign interference. That goes far wider. The House has rules about that. They are enforced. We have lay members on our Committee of Standards. Obviously, this, to stop something, you have to find out that it happens, but there is no sign that this is particularly happening. On cybersecurity, yes, obviously, this is something we take seriously. Social media, I believe there's guidance and training available. And I think, as I say, on other things, you're best to talk to Alison.
Thank you, Ms. Sampson. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madame Gaudreau. Ms. Sampson, without trying to assume, the time it will take for interpretation would not be taken away from the member's time. So please do hear the interpretation out before responding. Unless you would prefer to respond in French, then you're welcome to do that as well. But otherwise, whatever official language of Canada of your choice is welcome. Madame Gaudreau.
You would not like my French.
You'd be surprised. We encourage everyone to try to speak as much as they can. So maybe for the next meeting, though, because we have a vote in a bit. Madame Gaudreau.
Good afternoon, Madam Clerk. We will take the time to speak slowly so that you understand what I am saying. Through you, Madam Chair, I would like, first of all, to be sure that in the explanation about the protocol, when there is a notice of a threat through your CSIS, is it sent to the Prime Minister or to the Speaker of the House? That is when your ISC warns of some event.
I think this is not something which I operationally deal with, but it isn't the role of the ISC to warn of threats to Parliament in that matter. Its role is to oversee the security services. As I say, I think this is better discussed in private, and I think you will get better answers from my colleague Alison Giles.
Well, who receives, first of all, the information when your equivalent of our CSIS, that is the ISC, feels that it is important to be shared? Is it the Prime Minister or is it the Speaker of the House?
I would imagine that it would be the Director of our security services, but these are not things on which I have detailed knowledge.
D'accord. All right. I have another question. When you speak about making public the results of an inquiry further to any potential sanction, what do you really mean when you say you make things public?
Are you talking about ISC inquiries or House of Commons Select Committee inquiries?
Les deux, qu'est-ce qui est rendu?
Both, please. What makes them public? For the ISC,
ISC, that is negotiated, with the Prime Minister, and then the ISC will lay its report before Parliament and publish it. You can find their reports on the internet, and that report will say whether or not there are redactions. So that's the process for the ISC. A House of Commons committee will always report in public. There is no facility, I believe, for a solely House of Commons committee to report privately. It will report to the House and publish it. What it might not do is publish the material on which it has relied. It will publish as much as it can so that people can understand why it's come to its conclusions, but it might redact some matters.
OK. Tantôt,
earlier, Madam Clerk, you did mention that intimidation is a clear contempt in terms of parliamentary privilege. I'd like to hear some of the examples that have occurred in your parliament and now form part of the case law, similar to what we are dealing with here.
I cannot think of one relating to foreign interference except for the matter of sanctions against UK members of Parliament who had criticised China. In that case, it wasn't dealt with as a contempt. It was a state-level action, and the response was to make clear that the Chinese ambassador was no longer welcome, although other members of the embassy are permitted to enter the precincts. So at the state level, it was not treated as a contempt. And it's hard to see how it could have been because it depends on someone being in the jurisdiction, and there is a particular sensitivity about diplomatic staff. In principle, the House of Commons powers to take action against them are unlimited. In practice, they are at liberty to leave the jurisdiction, and in exercising those powers, you would invite members to think very carefully about the framework of the Vienna Convention, which is supranational law, and about the possible implication for UK diplomats abroad. So, as I say, that sanctioning of UK members of Parliament for what they'd said in Parliament was not taken through the contempt jurisdiction. In terms of intimidation, which was dealt with as a contempt, the most recent attempt was somebody saying they would take legal action against a member for what they had said if they repeated what they had said in the House. Other similar contempts were saying that you'd withdraw funding for activities in a member's constituency, or that you would affect selection. So not much of our case law goes to foreign intimidation.
une question avec une réponse.
A question with a yes or no answer. According to your procedures, does Parliament have a possibility of disclosing or not that a member of Parliament is the subject of intimidation? Yes or no?
OK, merci.
Ms. Sampson, I think that was the first time that somebody was asked a yes or no question and we received it. That was excellent. Thank you. Mrs. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I thank the witness for being here with us today, and thank you for having this discussion about a challenge for many different levels of our other governments across the planet that is looking at this new view, and of course you in your role having to figure out the procedure within the House. I appreciate very much your dedication and work. So one of the things that we are really seized with in this process that we're going through around foreign interference in our elections and how it impacts directly some of the members of Parliament in our system is trying to figure out how to get information shared with us in a way that we can access some of it, but also recognizing we have to respect top secret information and, of course, making sure that we keep our partnerships strong with different countries that share information with us. So one of the questions that I have, and I believe you've talked about it a little bit with one of the previous questioners, is just if you can share any information that you have of how information is shared when it is very top secret within your system, but also if there is ever a history where any other department within the House of Commons takes information from, for example, for us it would be CSIS, and reviews it. So the example that I'm thinking of particularly here in Canada is we've had an offering that the law clerk within the House of Commons receive the information and review that information, and that their office decides which should be redacted and which should not be. We've heard several testimonies that that is not the safest way to go forward because, of course, the people who are enmeshed in the work are the best people to do the redactions. And I'm just wondering if you've ever seen that happen within the system that you're working in.
I think I can answer generally about confidential information. What I can't answer about is particularly security classified information, except to say that, yes, some of our committees get it, they handle it safely. Any one of whom's members can stand on the floor of the House of Commons and reveal secret information without any without any comeback. And that is the consequence of Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. It's very important. That isn't a barrier to information sharing where there's trust, but it does mean that trust is very important. And that does explain why the ISC, which is the committee which does get most high-level information, is so constrained, and there is such a strong statutory constraint about what it can have. And I should say, by the way, that the ISC is not headquartered in the House. It's headquartered over within government buildings, which helps keep matters secure. Turning away from classified information, but to information which committees have received, I mentioned that there have been orders passed for the government to put papers into the hands of committees. And those committees have agreed protocols, and indeed the Committee of Privileges, which I was very close to on another matter, agreed a very similar protocol for the handling of those papers. They were to be kept secure. They were to be accessed by members only in invigilated conditions. No electronic devices were allowed. Notes could be made on the papers. Each member had their own set of papers, but they couldn't be kept, but they couldn't be taken away from the room. There would be a record of who had accessed the papers. And while the two committees in question reserved the right to publish the papers, they said that they would consult the government, before they did it. So that is how we would do it. It also required having a very strong, upgrading the House of Commons safes. So it can be done, although I should stress that these were not top secret papers. They were papers which the government considered commercially sensitive and where there were criminal investigations going on. The committee respected those terms. Turning to your, I'm not sure I have very much else to add to that, thinking about it.
Sorry, interpreters. Well, thank you for that, and I only have a few seconds. So my last quick question is, I know that here, of course, when an MP is elected, they get training on different aspects of being a parliamentarian. So I'm just wondering, is there any expansion of training through the House on how to identify if foreign interference may be impacting you?
We are doing a great deal more on security briefing than we used to. I'm not familiar with the details of that briefing, but one of our problems, we're very worried about the physical threat to members before you get on to foreign interference. So I'm sure we'll start by focusing on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the clock is just under 5 minutes, and I am going to ask if suitable, and if not suitable, you don't have to say anything, just show me your displeasure in what I'm saying. Mr. Nader just has 2 minutes of questions. We could then go for a vote and get 2 minutes to Mrs. Romanado and a quick question before noon, if that's okay. And if anything happens, because if somebody has to go vote, you're welcome to go. If something was to happen, I will commit to suspending the meeting right away because, perfect. Mr. Nader, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Sampson, for joining us today. And I might offer our congratulations as well. I understand you've been named a Commander of the British Empire in the King's Honours List, birthday honours list. So congratulations on behalf of your counterparts here in Canada. I wanted to follow up on Ms. Blaney's comments about kind of some of the processes for the production of papers. Like the UK, you know, our committees have that authority to command papers as part of the grand inquest of the nation. But I wanted to follow up kind of, you talked about some of the procedures that could be in place. And I was curious, in a situation where a commitment was made around a committee table that the government would be allowed to redact certain documents, withhold certain information, whether there would be a parliamentary double check, so to speak. For example, in Canada, we have a law clerk. I believe the counterpart would be the Speaker's Council. Whether there'd be opportunity for the Speaker's Council, or in our case, the law clerk, to verify information that might be redacted, that might be withheld, along certain parameters that the committee or that the House might set.
This has come up in my experience about matters which aren't secret, so I'm not sure how helpful my answer will be. I think the committee itself will take a judgment. If it is the names of junior civil servants, it will not mind. If it is if they think there might be something more contentious, they will press for it. So, for example, the Committee of Privileges has recently done an inquiry into the conduct of the former Prime Minister and asked for the notes of an inquiry into parties, or the interview notes. They were provided at first in a redacted form, and the committee spent several months pressing until the government produced them unredacted. So I think the answer is the committee will look and take a sense check of the sort of things that have been redacted. But it might, for example, it is, the House will delegate certain things to officials. So, for example, if there are police searches on the parliamentary estate, which switches it round, and there is an issue about whether the police wish to look at privileged papers, the Clerk of the Journals and Speaker's Council together have helped the police assess the material and say, no, that's privileged, you know, yes, that's, as it might be a personal paper, you can have that. So there is some analogy for clerkly or law clerk involvement.
Thank you. And what I'm just going to do as we are approaching the vote, but the walk has to take place, is I'm going to go Mrs. Romanado 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witness for being here with us. I want to pick up on something you said earlier, that when there were actions regarding sanctions, that the action taken was state level rather than a contempt. And then when you did have to deal with the question of intimidating an MP, could you walk us through quickly how would we be able to determine if a member's privilege was breached if they were not aware of the intimidation tactics? Because that's what we're discussing today, is we're trying to determine whether or not MP Chong's privilege was breached based on intimidation through a foreign state actor, but MP Chong has testified he was not aware of it. So we're trying to determine whether or not there was a breach of privilege. If you have any expert advice in this regard, it would be most welcome.
There was a similar case, or an analogous case, where the Sussex police took action against a member for what he'd said in the House. They issued with a notice designed to stop harassment, and that was held to be a contempt. The member knew it was it was designed to stop him doing it again. But at the same time, the police had recorded, I think, a complaint about the member's alleged racism, and they'd done it privately. And that was held not to be a contempt because the member didn't know, so he couldn't have been intimidated or impeded. I can send your clerk the link to the report.
That would be most welcome, actually, because that's kind of what we're dealing with, whether or not someone's privilege was breached if they were not aware. Thank you.
I think the word's there. If you look at what a contempt is, it's not just something which does impede a member. It's something which has a tendency. And I think you might want to reflect on whether, knowing that it might have happened, obviously you can think about anything. You know, you can scare yourself, there's a tiger in the canopy of your double bed. But if you know that something is likely to have happened, then you might be getting onto the tendency angle.
Thank you so much.
Mrs. Sampson, thank you so much for your time. We are just going to pause to vote, so the vote is live for anyone using the app. And if it's suitable, do you mind sticking around for about 15 minutes?
This is very familiar to me.
Okay, perfect. Because then what we will do is Madame Gaudreau and Mrs. Blaney will just get in a quick question, and then we'll do the switch over. And I will just note that we know that you are the expert when it comes to privilege in the House, but I think we're trying to figure out kind of where there's abilities and how you operate. So we do appreciate you broadening the scope of your expertise and just where members are coming from. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for waiting.
It's a very simple one. It's my last question. I would like to give you the opportunity to make suggestions to us that we here could use to bring about change. You have mentioned that for all practical purposes, you've looked at how we operate here in our committee in Parliament. How can we improve what we do?
Is this about foreign interference or about I don't know I do not know whether the Canadian Parliament has a security department or how that operates. We have over the years have great increases in the capability and professionalism of our security department. It was always helpful. And I think that having that informal is the wrong word. Having a very capable security department is the key to it. But as a procedural and privilege expert, I'm not sure I can tell you too much about it, except that has vastly increased my peace of mind.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
And quickly, just the last question that I have for you today, and again, thank you so much for being here, is you talked about your security department. Here, of course, we have similarly the Sergeant at Arms. And one of the changes that we've made around foreign interference, or that is in the process of changing, I should say, is more connection with the Sergeant at Arms, who will connect with members of Parliament and let them know if they're being targeted for anything specific around foreign interference. And I'm just wondering if you guys have a similar process and how that is effective, or if there's any concerns. Thank you.
Before giving evidence, I discussed with Alison Giles about her remit, my remit, and what should be said in public. So I think if I may, I'll suggest that when you see Alison, you ask her.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. With that, we really want to thank you for your time and attention today, Ms. Sampson. And I know you will be sending some information to our clerk. We will have that translated in both official languages and circulated around. Should anything else come to mind, please do not hesitate to reach out. But once again, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank you for your time and attention today, and we wish you a good rest of the day. With that, committee members, we will just suspend for a quick 30 seconds to do the switch over for our next panel. So meeting suspended. Please don't go. Lord Elcock, former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and from the Bureau, we have Samuel Cooper, investigative journalist. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement. And Mr. Cooper, we'll start with you. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you. It's an honor to be called to testify. My name is Sam Cooper, and I am now reporting for my own journalism platform, the Bureau. The Bureau's first two stories are relevant to your examination today of information I have reviewed in documents regarding Beijing's, quote, threatening Canada's elected officials to deter criticism, end quote. First, I wish to inform the committee of how I collected knowledge on these matters in the past decade. While covering foreign investment in Vancouver real estate, I started researching foreign interference in connection to the public statements of former CSIS Director Richard Fadden in 2010. In September 2014, for the Province newspaper, I authored a story titled, Is China Influencing BC's Municipal Politicians? The story, using access to information, examined CSIS documents. In March 2015, for the Province, I authored another story titled, Chinese police run secret operations in BC to hunt allegedly corrupt officials and laundered money. I believe these stories provide historical context for this committee. Now to the 2021 federal election. I'll quote from now public information in my June 17th article for the Bureau, an extended interview with MP Aaron O'Toole. In the published interview, I told Mr. O'Toole, quote, I have reported about this January 2022 Privy Council Office intelligence report sourced from 100 CSIS reports. What the document said is that a small number of MPs in the 2021 election reported concern for their families, their privacy, their reputations, and their re-election chances as a result of targeted CCP activity. Mr. O'Toole answered, quote, that's very troubling to hear. I'm not surprised because when I was briefed on the examples of intelligence that were shared with me, some of the activities were so intense in the Greater Toronto Area and the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, it would not surprise me if people were followed, tabs kept on people, intimidation, voter suppression. I questioned Mr. O'Toole again, saying, quote, I learned from sources aware of CSIS investigations in 2021 that CSIS officers found that Chinese officials in Toronto were following one MP during the campaign. They were also allegedly approaching voters in relation to this candidate. And CSIS found this activity, I was told, coordinated and alarming. Mr. O'Toole answered, Well, that seems to coordinate or correspond completely with the fourth element that I included in my speech in the House of Commons, which is one clear example of voter suppression in a riding in Canada. Finally, I'll quote from the preamble from my interview with Mr. O'Toole in my article. In it, I explained that I personally received a CSIS threat brief in 2021 after my book on Chinese foreign interference in Canada was published. I wrote in my June 17th article for the Bureau, quote, a CSIS officer met me in Ottawa. I was told that Chinese security agents in Canada are dangerous, and they were tasked to look into my background, study the impact of my book, and to discover my reporting sources, end quote. I believe this information provides important context for the committee that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to influence or intimidate journalists in the same way it seeks to influence or threaten Canadian politicians. Thanks. I look forward to your questions, and I'm sure the honourable members understand I take the protection of my sources very seriously, so please understand I cannot answer questions about identifying confidential sources or speak about editorial or legal processes regarding my prior reporting. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Alcock, welcome to PROC. The floor is yours.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the introduction. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions that any members may have, although obviously I'm still subject to the security of information legislation, so there are limits to what I can say, obviously, even from my memories.
And thank you for those comments. We will enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I will direct my questions to Mr. Cooper. You reported that, of no relation, you reported that Beijing's Toronto consulate directed clandestine funding through proxies in the 2019 election. Can you elaborate on how this scheme worked?
Again, I'm going to have to be very within the lines of the reporting that I did and not speak to the collection of sourcing, whether it be from persons with awareness of investigations or persons with awareness of the January 2022 Privy Council Office special report sourced from 100 CSIS reports. I have commented that this document is sourced from investigations started in the Toronto area in January 2019, according to my understanding. And the document very clearly states that, from my recollection, the Toronto consulate directed clandestine funding into an election interference network. And as the members know, the stories had great impact. We're here today because of that story. And I do need to not speak very freely about the sourcing or the methods that I understand. I need to stick to simply the stories speak for themselves.
And I recognize that, but the Prime Minister, in response to your reporting, has repeatedly claimed that he never was briefed about, quote, candidates receiving money from China. Now, it's my observation that that statement is very, very carefully crafted and deliberate, because it seems to me to be unlikely that Beijing would simply transfer funds directly to a candidate, that the scheme would be significantly more elaborate than that. So based upon the intelligence that you reviewed, did Beijing indirectly fund candidates in the 2019 election through this clandestine network?
I'll, before answering your question, refer back to, I know the members paid close attention to the speech of MP Aaron O'Toole, and on his CSIS threat briefing, he spoke of from my recollection, concrete funding of a misinformation product through the United Front Work Department directed from Beijing so that funds are paid in Canada, my understanding of his speech, which funds a misinformation product, essentially from my understanding of his speech to attack Mr. O'Toole's reputation. So I think it's fair to say that conversely, I've explained in a number of interviews about my reporting, Beijing uses carrots and sticks. So if we were talking about the concrete funding of a misinformation product, a stick to attack a member of parliament, it is very reasonable and according to sources with awareness of the investigations to understand that the consulate is also directing funds into an election interference network comprised of many different types of individuals, comprised of what I understand and have read in a Privy Council Office intelligence assessment, media entities that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So with regards to your question, did Beijing fund candidates? It's my understanding they funded a network which is directed to support Beijing's preferred candidates. And as Member O'Toole told me in my interview for the first story, he wasn't going to speak to the exact methods of transfer. I don't know that CSIS has visibility on exchanges, physical exchanges, wire transfers. Perhaps, Mr. Elcock, technology has advanced, but I can tell you that CSIS has and studies FinTrack records, and that can, I believe and I understand that FinTrack records will provide revelations on direct methods of transfer and where money went.
Now, Mr. O'Toole did cite essentially four ways in which Beijing interfered in the 2021 election based upon your review of intelligence relating to the 2019 election. Is it accurate to say that they employed the same methods or similar methods?
I believe it's accurate to say that the United Front Work Department has very large, very sophisticated networks of community proxies. I just reported in my first story for the Bureau several days ago that citing the NSI COP 2019 Foreign Interference Review, the Consul General in Vancouver, round about 2015, boasted of controlling over 100 community groups. I have done a number of reports pointing towards the control of community groups and community leader proxies to support certain candidates, and this support can come through, according to the documents I've read, funds and media support, logistical support.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Elcock, I've been paying particular attention to some of the interviews that you've been doing in the media over the course of the past few months. And there's been many times where I've thought the remarks that you've made have been quite insightful on the matters of foreign interference. One thing in particular that you've said multiple times is that you felt that these intelligence leaks over multiple months have been kind of a slow drip and that they were likely politically motivated. Can you explain why you would say that?
I think one of the alternatives, in terms of trying to determine who the leaker is, one of the alternatives is that there is a political motivation. I don't have I can't be certain about that because I obviously don't know who the leaker is, and at this point, so far as we know, nobody knows who the leaker is. But certainly that would be a possible motivation. It is striking the way in which has been striking throughout the process, however, how the information flow was managed. I assume it was not dripped out to the news media or to various reporters that had the information, but that it flowed over a shorter period of time, and but it has been very carefully dripped out to keep the story going as much as anything, perhaps. But the idea of political motivation is hard to avoid.
Thank you. And Mr. Cooper, to you now. On March 22nd, you published an article with the headline, Liberal MP Han Dong secretly advised Chinese diplomat in 2021 to delay freeing the two Michaels. Do you stand by this headline?
I don't write the headlines, but I stand by the story. I know that Global News stands by the story, and there is a legal procedure underway. And the story speaks for itself, and the statement of defense speaks for itself. The story stands.
Thank you. So despite the fact that the article used the term allegedly at least about 10 times, you chose to frame the headline, or the newspaper chose to frame the headline excluding that language in the headline. Was that done on purpose?
I said at the outset I won't speak to editorial processes or legal procedures, but I can assure the honourable member that legal vetting and editorial vetting of these stories is extremely rigorous.
Thank you.
That's
and
all I'll say.
Why didn't you
matter.
include allegedly in the headline, Mr. Cooper?
Sorry?
Why did you not include allegedly in the headline?
This is a matter for editorial procedures and legal vetting procedures.
Okay. Did you review the transcript from the supposed conversation between MP Dong and the Consular General?
I told the honourable member at the outset that I'm not going to speak to editorial processes, identification of sources, or legal procedures around this story, and I'll repeat it again and again.
Thank you. And will you table the supposed transcript that we've learned from the Right Honourable David Johnson's report does exist? If you have or haven't reviewed that, I understand you won't talk about it. Will you table that with this committee, the transcript, please?
I didn't prepare any materials around that question, and I'll stand, as I told the honourable member, I'm not going to speak to
You can send
materials.
it in later, Mr. Cooper, if you'd like. We'd be happy if you would table it with the committee. Will you table it with the committee?
Going back to my introduction, I'm not going to speak to editorial processes or legal processes around
So
prior
Global News
stories.
has, that report has actually put in a statement that Global News has not confirmed the allegations in the story. And the Globe and Mail refused to run a story, similar story, because they couldn't verify the claim that was made in that story. So what I'm interested to know is, you know, based on the fact that these were allegations, in the statement of defense, Global News also says that these were allegations and not meant to be taken as fact. How could you, with any degree of journalistic integrity, publish an article that is sheerly just based on unfounded allegations?
The article is based on going back to my opening statement for the honourable member, and I'll reiterate it again and again. The story stands. I will not speak to identification of sources. I will not speak to editorial processes, and I want the member to remember, I will not speak to legal processes surrounding this story.
Thank you for that. Mr. Cooper, the Canadian Association of Journalists has ethics guidelines that state, we journalists seek documentation to support the reliability of these sources and their stories, and are careful to distinguish between assertions and fact. The onus is on us to verify all information. Do you agree that that is the ethics guideline that you should be following as a journalist?
The story stands, and we're here today because of a body of reporting, and I'll remind the member that I said I'm not going to speak to editorial processes.
So is that a no then? You don't
No,
believe
it's
that
not
you
a
should
no.
follow the ethics guideline for your own profession?
The answer, honourable member, is the story stands and the body of work stands.
Okay, so
And
we
we are
know
here
that the
today
headline
because of
was
the body of work.
demonstrably false, sir.
I'm just going to pause and just remind us that one person speaks at a time. Mr. Cooper, I know that you're not a stranger to how committees operate, so there is sometimes repetition around here, and I think it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. So members do have the time, and if we can just have an exchange back and forth, because the work that we're doing, it's important work. But I will just, a reminder, one person speaks at a time because it helps with the record and translation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, the Right Honourable David Johnson, the Director of CSIS, deputy ministers and ministers all confirm that the headline that you published as a part of that story was demonstrably false. So did you knowingly mislead Canadians?
The story stands. The editorial procedures and the legal procedures around that story are subject of a legal procedure, as you know. And at the outset, I told the honourable member the story stands, and I will not speak to editorial processes or legal procedures regarding my prior story.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau, 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Madame Gaudreau. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I'd like to dig a little deeper about motives, about grounds. How can it be? So my questions will approach the matter from the perspective of what would have been the motivation to have an article like that in November 2022. I'd like to hear you on that.
If I understand the question, it's about what is the editorial or vetting process or the motivation of a journalist to report on. Could you rephrase, please?
Of the subject matter, what was the motivation in your work, the grounds in your work that led you to be concerned with this particular subject?
As I said in my opening statement, after hearing and researching and filing access to information requests regarding former CSIS Director Richard Fadden's very public statement, I was working in Vancouver in a major newspaper, and I was seeing and hearing of activities related to financial crime that started to appear possibly to feed into foreign interference type activities. So the motivation for me started about over 10 years ago to understand essentially public interest questions that were very current, these were matters that people in Vancouver wanted to know about. I completed a body of reporting in Vancouver. I then landed in Ottawa, as it were, and my motivation at that time was I understood this is the seat of power in Canada, and that decisions taken around foreign investment, matters of laws that CSIS or the RCMP is regulated by, and whether foreign actors can be prosecuted or can freely operate. This was my motivation, and as I've explained, I do a number of podcast interviews about some of my stories, and especially my book. My book, which was called Willful Blindness, delved into the connectivity that I know that you've heard from Commissioner Duhim recently. He was recently on a 60 Minutes Australia and said that that is the RCMP, was seeing connectivity between organized crime and directly up to the Chinese state. This was the subject matter of my book, and so by making findings in my book, this led to more information, if you will, in Ottawa coming to me. And when I found this new information and how laws have not been changed to so that the government of Canada can really find connections to foreign agents that are easily found now in the United States, as we see in so-called 110 police station prosecutions. As my first story said, it quoted a CSIS officer saying, at this point, it's just CSIS telling politicians, hey, be careful out there. There are no laws and regulations that allow really firm deterrent or prosecution or investigation even.
I know, Madam Chair, this is a rather delicate question, but I'm quite convinced that Mr. Cooper could answer it. when your sources confirm or deny information, what leads them to disclose? So there must be something deep within them that leads them to come to speak to you. So what can motivate these sources? What makes them come to you to talk about your subject?
It's a very simple answer. Again, my book, Willful Blindness, really grew out of disclosures from a casino anti-money laundering official named Ross Alderson. He was very concerned about the activity he saw, and his view was that there was willful blindness with British Columbia's government with regards to the lack of prosecution against transnational crime and money laundering. I understand that people in Ottawa, people in other jurisdictions, including the United States, I've said that people in the Pentagon were interested in my book. So there are officials at a high level that understand what's happening in Canada, and there are whistleblowers that don't believe that the adequate laws are in place to investigate and prosecute foreign interference. This can be the type of motivation for sources, simply national security and patriotism.
I don't have very much time left, unfortunately, but I do have a question for Mr. Alcock. You were in place from 94 to 2004. What were the directives or the ministerial guidelines that existed at that time with respect to threats or with respect to interference?
Madam Chair, in response to the honourable member's question, it's a bit of a challenge to make a short answer. The issue of foreign interference is really just espionage. It is a subset of espionage involving sometimes not necessarily intelligence services, but foreign actors. We treated it then, as it is largely treated now, as espionage, attracting counter-espionage programs on the part of the service, I'm sure even today, and back then as well. Were there specific directions to provide information to people? No. The reality is CSIS was established to provide information to the government itself, and was in fact specifically enjoined from providing it beyond the government. So giving threat briefings to people was very complicated then, still is relatively complicated now, although there are some new directions that allow perhaps more flow of information.
I would like to have a question on second round. Thank you, sir. Thank you to you.
I'm going to go with the same approach as earlier, unless we come to a different conclusion, and just keep us moving in this meeting. Mrs. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and of course I thank the witnesses for being here. I'm going to start by asking a question or two for Mr. Alcock. Thank you again for being here. We've heard a lot of testimony over the last several months, and we also have heard very clearly from Canadians that they're worried about what's happening in terms of foreign interference and what that means for our democracy. And of course, my major concern is that if Canadians lose faith in their institutions, it becomes very hard to do the things that we need to do in a safe way. So I guess my question to you is we've heard a lot of testimony from ministers about not knowing that certain MPs were being targeted, that information was provided, but they didn't receive it in a timely fashion. It just seems to not make any sense. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts with your time serving in that role about communication processes, and if there was any concerns that you had at that time about making sure that people had the right information to make decisions that they needed to make in those levels.
Madam Chair, in response to the honourable member's question, it's rarely hard for intelligence services, once they get beyond the idea that you're collecting secret intelligence and you've decided that you have to share it. Most intelligence agencies want to share intelligence information with higher levels of government. I think the problem in this country is that pretty much across all phases of our, whether it's Parliament, whether it's government, whether it's the bureaucracy or whatever, we're not a country that has much concern about national security. Most Canadians have very little concern about national security and little interest over the years, and it's not surprising then that sometimes the flow of information to beyond the intelligence agency is not as good as it should be if people have no interest. Unless we build a culture of more of a culture of national security, we don't necessarily have to rise to the level of our neighbor to the south, which is a little more obsessed with the subject. But unless we do develop a broader understanding of national security issues, care more about it, both Canadians and government at all levels, then the reality is the flow of information will not happen because nobody's really interested.
Well, thank you for that. And we know that if, according to the current legislation, the CSIS legislation, it says very clearly that if an MP is targeted, it's really up to the minister to decide what information is given to members of Parliament. Of course, we know that there's been a change in that process through a ministerial directive. But I'm still concerned about that. So I'm just wondering, in your thought, is it time for us to review that section of legislation? And is there a better process to review it on a more regulated format?
Madam Chair, I think that one can overcomplicate the issue of providing flow of information. There are challenges to providing information to anybody beyond the service, because what you're talking about is counter-espionage operations, which are very sensitive and very difficult. So the disclosure of information that discloses the existence of investigations is complicated. The flow of information to members of Parliament really ought to be couched around a level of risk. If there is a real level of risk. If there is a real level of risk, then information should flow in some way. For example, there was not a member of Parliament, or not a minister, but there was the murder recently in British Columbia, and there was a report in the paper that there was a threat briefing for that individual from CSIS. There were obviously death threats in respect of that individual. That's very serious. And at that point, you clearly want to try and make sure information flows. Whether all information about all levels of foreign interference need to flow, that's a big question. And I doubt very much whether it's in the interests of counter-espionage operations for all of that information to flow in order to protect those operations.
Well, another discussion that we've had here is around education and having more broad education for Canadians on the whole, so that there's better understanding of what foreign interference could look like, and at least that critical thought. So you talked about building a culture of concern. Do you think that education of members of Parliament, government, and also all levels of government, and also just everyday Canadians is a key part of that process?
I'm not sure that, I think the hope, Madam Chair, is that on the part of many people in the community, intelligence and national security community, was that talking about issues more about national security would cause people to care more about them. I suspect that probably doesn't really happen. I suspect it requires something more like the current discussion, although I don't like the way in which it has happened. And it's entirely inappropriate, but it clearly has stimulated some discussion. Unfortunately, I think some of it has been overly mired in politics and partisan politics in particular.
Well, thank you for that. And so when you talk about a culture of concern, then how do we create that? What's your opinion on that?
I think you create, Madam Chair, I think that the way to create that is ultimately for Canadians to have an interest in national security issues and to pay attention to those issues, and to demand that their elected representatives also pay attention to those issues. Mm-hmm. In my view, elected officials are wise people. If they know that the average Canadian doesn't care about national security, I suspect there are not many elected officials who are going to spend a lot of time on national security issues. Mm-hmm. If Canadians demand that people pay attention to those issues, then there will inevitably be more discussion of them, and we will perhaps arrive at a place that most of our allies arrived at years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to the second round with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cooper, in your June 15th article in the Bureau, you indicate that in the NSCOP report from 2019 on foreign interference, that report states that, quote, there were important gaps in the documents, close quote, disclosed by the PCO to NSCOP. Are you able to elaborate upon that in any way?
I've read the document, and that story that you cite included a number of quotations, and I would say my very rigorous analysis of the document and the findings. The panel examined 620 intelligence documents representing over 4,000 pages of material, and they noted that CSIS was very forthcoming in disclosures. The RCMP was forthcoming. Public Safety Canada contributed little, is the wording, and the quotation that I wrote in that story was that there were important gaps in Privy Council office documents. So that was a terse statement, and there was no context beyond that statement. I can make an educated assessment that, as the honourable members know, the Privy Council office is there to give counsel on national security matters to the cabinet. And if there were important documents missing, it would lead me to speculate that perhaps there were records that would have provided more clarity on what was known about key risks. And I can't give the member any more information than that.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. You noted in your interview with Aaron O'Toole that you'll be reporting more on the Beijing police activities in Canada. You said, quote, "We now have reports of Beijing officials coming into Canada under false cover and acting within these so-called police networks. It's not just about buildings, it's about networks and community meetings," closed quote. So can you elaborate upon that?
Yes, I will be reporting on those matters further, but I think it's fair to share my generalized knowledge today about why my public interest standards are so focused on the issue. I understand from many years of source disclosure and knowledge that including my own ventures into Hong Kong Canadian and Chinese Canadian diaspora communities, Uyghur Canadian communities, that there is an unacceptable level of fear within some of these communities that foreign officials, suspected foreign officials, are coming into Canada. I reported on a case, again, citing my book, China's Most Wanted, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was a man named Lai Cheng-sing. There are enough court documents that the members can search his case. I think this context is important. He came to Canada and was engaged in underground casino, money laundering, criminal activities. He was also, the evidence showed, quite connected to the various sectors of the Chinese security and intelligence apparatus, and yet he got on the wrong side of some people in Beijing, and they pursued him with police agents from the Ministry of Public Security and a special unit who came into Canada under false sort of business visas. And I understand that this activity has accelerated since 2015 in Canada. The police stations we now know of because of Safeguard Defenders, but it's about community networks with, my sources say, feared people acting both with officials from China to question people, to intimidate people in the community. And again, it's not about 6 or 7 known buildings in Canada, as the Safeguard defenders say. This is about networks and the flow of communications between the Ministry of Public Security and, as we see in the indictments in the United States, proxies that live, work, and do business in communities. And that's what I am concerned about in cities, including Toronto and Vancouver.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Mr. Cooper, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to perhaps, and maybe I can clarify the question again regarding whether before writing your first article, you had reviewed some sort of transcript or listened to a tape. I know that you said you won't reveal you won't be speaking to legal proceedings or editorial decisions, and of course we don't want you to reveal sources, but I believe that it's a question that you should be able to answer as to whether you reviewed or read a transcript before coming up with this story on Handong.
Which story are you referring to, sir?
I'm referring particularly to the allegations regarding the member from Don Valley North.
Yeah, with apologies to the honourable member, I can say that I have reviewed documents, I have spoken with sources with knowledge of the high-profile and sensitive investigations started in 2019, but I can't speak further to the nature of editorial and legal procedures surrounding that particular story.
Was that document a transcript?
I'm not going to answer that because as I've said, I won't speak to editorial or legal procedures in detail surrounding stories, but the story speaks for itself, and we're referring to a story that is subject of legal activity, and the filed statement of defense speaks to all the information that you will get on that.
Well, Global News' legal statement says that they were in particular allegations and not factual findings. Would you agree with this, Mr. Cooper?
The story regards information from sources who make allegations. It's very clear that there has been no prosecutions or findings of fact regarding that story or any of the matters we're here speaking about. If the member would let me finish, we are here today in a very generalized way because we don't have a foreign interference registry. We have recommendations in NSI COP 2019 please let me finish, that this government
I think
study.
I'm going to actually just pause.
Thank you, Mr.
Cooper. Once again, I know that everyone has their purposes. You're always welcome, Mr. Cooper, to provide us information. We will have it translated in both official languages, but I do need the exchange from member to witness to flow back and forth with not overlap. Because at the end of the day, it is members' time. I will always ensure that witnesses have some time to answer, but usually just matching the length of time consumed on either end. Back to Mrs. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're definitely here today because of a story that you published, and that's what brings us here. So I really wanted to make it more clear. Do you think you possibly could have gotten it wrong?
No, the story stands, and the legal.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the Governor General stated unequivocally that the member from Don Valley North had not discussed extending the legal detention of Michael Koverg and Michael Spavor with Chinese government officials, and I quote that it was said, "I have reviewed the same intelligence report that was provided to the Prime Minister relating to the allegations," and this is in regards to MP Dong, "which I am advised is the only intelligence that speaks to this issue. I can report the following. The allegation is false. Mr. Dong discussed the two Michaels with a PRC official, but did not suggest to the official that the PRC extend their detention." This report has caused Mr. Dong, a member of Parliament, in addition to that his family and many others, a lot of harm, and perhaps irreparable harm. Do you have any comments to that?
My only comment is the story starting in November 2022. meet the highest standards of public interest. And public interest reporting, referring back to my last attempted answer, NSI COP 2019 asked this government to look at the Security of Information Act, the CSIS Act, and to look into the measures taken in Australia in 2018.
We'll be heading down that direction, so I appreciate that. I also understand you mentioned you work for the Bureau right now. I wanted to know that you've talked many times about transparency, and upon Googling, you can't really find out what the source to the Bureau is. So who funds the Bureau?
I think I'll have more to say about that now, but I can assure the member it's not a foreign government or anyone outside of Canada.
But why can you not let us know then that where the funding comes from?
I didn't come here prepared today to disclose what a public interest investigative reporter who's looking into important matters, who may or may not be, interested in my reporting.
I think, though, as a journalist, that you would be interested in knowing who you work for. You can find out easily the Globe, the National Post, where their funding comes from. Why not the Bureau?
The Bureau is a subscription-driven platform on Substack. As the honourable members know, that Canadian media is changing, and authors, writers such as Terry Glavin are on Substack now. This is about subscribers.
Thank you. We're going to go 2.5 minutes to Madame Gaudreau, followed by Mrs. Blaney. Madame Gaudreau.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question for each of you. The first is for Mr. Alcock. If you had the opportunity to have a conversation with the Prime Minister, with all the expertise that you have witnessed in terms of progression of issues, and it's been some months now that we've been trying to shed light on this matter, what would be your ultimate piece of advice for the Prime Minister to say what should be done? Because we're at that point.
Madam Chair, I have given advice to Prime Ministers in the past. I'm not sure that in this case I would know enough to give advice to this particular Prime Minister. I do think the government probably could have acted faster on issues of foreign interference, which is a serious issue, although sometimes I disagree with what people see as serious and not so serious foreign interference. Having said that, the reality of much of the reporting, I think, is I think that there's some question about whether all the reporting that we in the public and in Parliament have seen is in fact accurate. And I think that comes both from the testimony of people before this and other committees, but also the report of Mr. Johnston. If the facts on which we are all operating out here in the public are not accurate, then it's pretty hard to give the Prime Minister advice.
Yes, I don't have much time, Chair, but what I understand is that we now have to act now. We have evolved. Everything has been increased, warnings have been issued, and the moment to act is now. We have to shed light on this type of issue to demystify it. That's what you should perhaps say to the Prime Minister. Let's go.
In a sense, Madam Chair, I agree with the member's point that the Prime Minister, and I said it a second ago, that probably the government should have acted on foreign interference perhaps earlier than it has, and more determinedly than it has. Having said that, foreign interference is a very large problem, and most of the discussion, frankly, that I've seen is on a relatively narrow part of foreign interference. in this country. There is a lot more to do with foreign interference than so far that I have seen in any discussions, public discussions. So action sounds simple, but it's not necessarily easy. For example, a registry makes a great deal of sense, but there is also a lot of view out there, I think, that a registry will solve a lot more problems than it really will. A lot of the problems of foreign interference will not be solved by a registry.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney?
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'm going to come back to Mr. Alcock. So you just answered my previous colleague's question, and you said that it needs to be broader, and the conversation that you're seeing so far in the public sphere is more narrow, and that the foreign agent registry is not the only thing that needs to happen. So what do you think it needs to be in terms of broadening? What are the areas that we should be focusing on, and where do you feel that we're being too narrow in our discussions?
Madam Chair, I think, while I may not agree with everything, all of Mr. Cooper's reports, news reports are, after all, news stories, not fact necessarily. The reality is that the things that we need to do are broader than simply registries. We need more counterintelligence work because you need to identify all of the activities, which means more funding probably for CSIS. We need to be looking at issues, for example, why is it that the Chinese media, Chinese language media in this country largely follows Beijing's line on Ukraine and a variety of other issues? We would not tolerate that with RT. In the case of Russia or Russian reporting. Why is it that Chinese language reporting in Canada often follows Beijing's line? Is it controlled by Beijing? Do we know? There are a wide variety of issues on foreign interference that need to be engaged on, not just some of the issues that frankly have been discussed in committee hearings as a result of a number of leaks.
Well, thank you, and I think that brings us back to a really important point, which is diaspora communities have been coming forward for a very long time, talking about concerns that they have and not feeling that they are really getting the response that they require. So when you discuss this, do you think having better connections with those communities and really amplifying those voices is an important part of us addressing the issues of foreign interference?
Madam Chair, it certainly is important to have close connections to diaspora communities. It is sometimes rather more difficult than the honourable member might suggest or might appear to suggest, in the sense that many parts of the community are unwilling to come forward and unwilling to have discussions, and some parts of the community actually share the views of the foreign country. So this is not an issue that is going to be easily resolved overnight.
Thank you. We are at 3 minutes of bells left. Do we need another round, or do you want one more round? Yeah. So what we're going to ask Mr. Cooper and Mr. Alcock is that we have our vote, and then we'll have up to 10 minutes for members to return to this room, and we'll just do one more quick, we'll finish this round. Which will be 5 minutes to the Liberals, 5 minutes to the Conservatives, 5 minutes to the Liberals, and then we'll get into our committee business. Okay? Thank you. So meeting suspended. Please stay tuned. For the vote to take place. The floor, 5 minutes à Mr. Berthold, suivi.
5 minutes for Mr. Berthold, followed by Madame Romanado. Mr. Berthold, welcome to our guests, Mr. Cooper, Mr. Alcock, for being here. We note that the Liberals that have been the party in power for some 8 years now have been very quick to denounce your article, Mr. Cooper, and discredit it. But there were problems that you revealed in your article. And yet, on May the 3rd, 2018, the Prime Minister himself at World Press Freedom Day said that he said that he saluted journalistic freedom and he was very much against illegal arrests in some parts of the world that was intended to silence journalists. But now, Mr. Cooper, since your article, other journalists have followed up, have written articles, and the existence of what you confirmed has indeed been proven to be true. The Chinese police stations here, we learned Michael Chong, Aaron O'Toole, Jimmy Kwan also have been intimidated by Peking, and also members were informed about this by CSIS. Aaron O'Toole has confirmed it as well in terms of the interference in elections. But it would seem that the ministers and the Prime Minister have ignored all of this. And in fact, the relevancy of these disclosures have been even discounted by ministers. So, Mr. Cooper, I would like to hear you about Chinese interference, Beijing's interference in Canadian elections.
As I said in my opening statement, my knowledge of a Privy Council Office January 2022 special report cited that Beijing is threatening MPs who are critics of the Chinese Communist regime. So this is, I do think that MP Aaron O'Toole, in his speech in Parliament, in my view, accurately reflected that this is a growing, novel, expanding threat run through Beijing, or that is the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which seeks to egregiously control and intimidate diaspora communities. In my opening statement, I also said that because of my groundbreaking book about the Chinese Communist Party's interference networks, I myself, a journalist, received a CSIS defensive threat brief in 2021, the same time period where other MPs, we've learned, were being subject of disinformation in WeChat channels. MP Aaron O'Toole said these were funded through the United Front Work Department. So the threat to Canada, in my view, is it's not my view, it's NSICOP 2019 Review's position that Australia and Canada are being attacked in almost the exact same manner, and yet Australia in 2018, due to media reports about two PRC-linked donors that had funded about 7 million Australian dollars to the three major parties. This implicated allegedly an Australian senator. The media furor that followed, that is the public discourse that followed those media leak disclosures, led to the Australian new counter-interference laws. Similar activity in the United Kingdom after a very firm disclosure about an individual with the United Front Work Department funding parliamentarians in Britain. They have followed up with laws. Canada is facing the same or worse threat, and most concerning, our diaspora community members. Many of them have stated openly they feel they're not protected. So this is the nature of the threat against journalists, community members, politicians. Most concerning to me, more than any, is that Canadians are under fear that they cannot speak openly about matters because a growing power from a foreign state is impacting lives in Canada.
And on the relevancy of having an independent inquiry, a public inquiry, we saw what happened to the independent rapporteur. It just came to a dead halt. What is your thought on an independent public inquiry?
My thoughts accord with many of the experts. I believe Mr. Elcock's colleague, Mr. Fadden, says a public inquiry should take place. A number of the witnesses you've already heard from say a public inquiry will remove the partisan bickering, the point scoring on either sides. You won't have to hear from more journalists that take the unusual step of being called to testify. There will be an independent, deep, rigorous public study of not only what happened, but what can we learn from Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, New Zealand, and other nations, by the way, that are taking this very seriously. Germany, Taiwan. We need to learn from others in a public inquiry.
Thank you. Madame Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I'll be sharing my time with MP Fergus, but I just wanted to make a statement. Mr. Cooper, you're here today based on your reports, and I was really hoping for some answers. And your unwillingness to engage on simple questions and your lack of preparedness to respond to some of the questions is disappointing. I understand you cannot discuss something that is before the courts, but I know that we have had multiple questions that are very simple in nature. So I just wanted to get that on the record, that I was hoping to get some answers, as I take this subject very, very seriously. With that, I'll turn the rest of my time over to MP Fergus.
Thank you, Ms. Romanado. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Elcock, I have a couple of questions for you. I've heard you say in the media, some have called the person who's responsible for leaking the information, called them whistleblowers. I've also heard you say that you don't consider them whistleblowers. Can you tell the committee why you don't consider this person or persons whistleblower?
Madam Chair, I think the simplest explanation for that, in my view, is that usually in the case of a whistleblower, there is some element of wrongdoing, disclosure of wrongdoing on the part of the government. In this case, nobody's really alleging that there's wrongdoing. People are alleging that the government should have done more. Not quite the same thing as wrongdoing. Just because you get a security clearance doesn't mean you have the right to disclose information that's within your charge. So whoever the leaker is, they are, in point of fact, probably guilty of offences against the not the Official Secrets Act, going too far back in my time, but it's security of information legislation. They're in violation of the legislation and should be prosecuted.
You don't have to apologize for having experience, Mr. Elcock. Indeed, in your experience, when raw intelligence is presented to you, reported to you by women or men in the field or from some of our allies, how do you treat that information? You treat that as gospel, or do you treat that as information that needs to be confirmed?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, intelligence is it's a simple. I'm a lawyer by background. It's not evidence. It's information. You can give it some more credibility by collecting more information, by using other sources, by using technical methods to confirm information. But at the end of the day, intelligence is simply information you've received of whatever credibility you can attach to it. In the case of intelligence services, we probably have better means of confirming that information than, say, do the news media in terms of trying to confirm their intelligence. But in some senses, we're very similar. We're dealing with information that is, until we can get some more credibility or add some more credibility, unproven.
As a result, unless that is of a spectacular or most suppressing nature, I imagine then that information wouldn't be circulated until it had some corroboration.
Madam Chair, yes. Information that has not been confirmed, unless you have received it from a credible source and it is really time-sensitive information, there may be cases where information has to be moved up, but you would have to be very clear to whoever you're providing that information that its credibility is open to question. But you're right, if there isn't something time-sensitive about it, then information before it flows up needs to be confirmed.
Thank you very much for that. So, I will just assume then, just as you mentioned in journalism, just like intelligence gathering information, wouldn't be responsible to necessarily report on it unless there was the caveats that you added to it, without having some corroboration of that information then.
I can't speak to how, to the level of the journalists go to, although I do know most of my journalists I have known over the years, that most of them do do make efforts to confirm the information before they publish it. Having said that, as I said, the reality of an intelligence service is intelligence services do have ways of gaining credibility or giving credibility to information that are not really open to journalists. So by definition, journalism is a somewhat more inexact science than even the intelligence collection agencies. Work of intelligence collection agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Alcock, Mr. Cooper. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Cooper, Mr. Alcock, thank you for your time today. Thank you for the insights you've provided. If anything else comes to mind that you would like committee members to receive, please share it with the clerk. We'll have it translated in both official languages and circulated around. With that, we're just going to suspend for 30 seconds to see our guests out, and then we will be coming back to committee business with the floor going to Mr. Cooper. Meeting suspended.